Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited. We've got Pierre Menage going to be leading the session today. Pierre is a psychologist and family dispute resolution and has a whole lot of other strings to his bow, which hopefully he'll share with you. Just before I hand over Pierre, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of Australia and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Gunai people in Gippsland, and I think you're on Noongar land, is it? Or
yeah, Wodjuk country, on the banks of the Derby Irrigan.
Ah, wonderful.
And thank you for initiating that acknowledgement.
No.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, I think it's important, not just a function, a nod to convention. I think it is important. We are on unceded land.
Yeah.
Pierre, I would love to hand over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Joanne. Welcome, everyone. I'll just start off letting you know a little bit about me. I'm a psychotherapist and I've got many years' experience working in high conflict contexts. I started my career in child protection. I went to Relationships Australia as a couples therapist, and I learned a lot more about conflict there, and started working particularly with trauma because I learned that most people disturbed by psychological symptoms or emotional distress or problems had experienced some kind of trauma, usually family trauma. It became very interesting to look more at trauma. I started working in family therapy then and learned about narrative therapy and other modalities, which I'll talk about a little bit, I hope, later. And I eventually, started private practice in 2007, and I started there were two parts of my practice. One part was doing family therapy and individual counselling and therapy, and the other part was working in a family court as a single expert witness and sometimes as a court-appointed therapist. So it's called court-reportable family therapy. So confidentiality still applies in court-reportable family therapy, but the parties agree to share, the therapist may share information relevant to the children's interests. It's a more liberal confidentiality rule than would apply normally for therapists anyway. And a bit similar to what the confidentiality rules it's different for FDR. I'll just tell you a little bit about today. I've had quite a lot of success in working with people, some of whom were not referred to me for family therapy even. They were just referred for individual therapy. And like many people referred for therapy, they were experiencing symptoms related to family violence, neglect, etc., and neglect of children. And so I ended up requesting the consent of the parents to include them and the non-resident parent, if there was one, in the family therapy, because I had this notion I suspect a lot of people have, which is that a child's distress is best addressed in the context in which it developed. So by including family members of children referred to me for signs of distress, failure to concentrate at school, making trouble, etc., by including the parents and finding out their family history, was able to, and some of these people were involved in family court proceedings about parenting arrangements for their children. And I got some good results. And it was really exciting actually, because I got these people made agreements for themselves that saved them hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal costs. And the court was delighted as well. And I got very good feedback about this work from the court. And obviously, family therapy is very different to family dispute resolution. And some of the differences are that I can take a lot longer to attune myself to the patients or clients that I'm consulting. And we can build trust and understanding by going at their own pace, because initially people don't want to, they're too frightened. They don't want to, they're quite critical of the other family members and they feel not understood, etc. So, which is often the case in FDR practice as well, or even mediation over a fence dispute or anything, but particularly with children involved, I think. Anyway, so the reason I started studying FDRP, family dispute resolution, is that a few years ago, getting more and more referrals from people to do work with families that were in the court. And this lawyer said to me, you can't do what you're doing without being an FDRP. So I Googled and I found Mediation Institute, and I want to acknowledge what a good welcome you gave me, Joanne. Thank you. And it was a superb course and I learned a lot, and I find FDR really interesting and effective, particularly when people collaborate and are transparent about what's happening, you know. My introduction. Now, I just wanted to say that today I don't have all the answers, sadly, and I would like today to be a discussion. I will explore different scenarios that have challenged me and that have worked for me. I don't have many of those. I'll just give you a couple of examples if you're interested. And as I said, I've got many years' experience now in dealing with high conflict situations. I don't find it easy, but I do find it surprising sometimes the solutions that come up and how they come up with patience and invariable respect and trauma-sensitive practice. Because one of the things I've learned really clearly is that the people we deal with are traumatized. The separation, particularly of parents who have been sharing the care of their children, is a significant, potentially traumatizing event. I'm not saying it's always traumatizing, but what the research and my own experience tells us is that it usually is traumatizing for those who have a history of attachment rupture as children. And research also tells us that most people who have a potentially traumatizing incident and didn't have any attachment rupture when they were children, which is, I think most people have some kind of attachment rupture, personally.
John, do you want to maybe explain a little bit more by what you mean by attachment rupture?
Yeah, sure. There's a really interesting longitudinal study called the Harvard Family Pathway Study. It's a 30-year longitudinal study that was exploring caregiving contributions to positive adaptation and psychiatric symptoms in early adulthood. And they video and codified the interactions of babies with their mothers. They call them caregivers, but it was mothers. And that doesn't mean that the mothers are at fault or more harmful than fathers or caregivers. It just means, as Siobhan Fisher explained, it just means that women are usually the only ones who are willing to hang in there and do all that early childhood caregiving, right? And what they found is the idea that they were really looking for patterns of interaction between mothers and babies on the one hand, and early adulthood psychiatric symptoms like suicidality and borderline personality disorder, they called it, the borderline personality disorder. So I'm training in neurofeedback therapy, which is a very strong evidence-based trauma therapeutic system modality. And I'm referencing things I've learned from Sabine Fisher, who wrote a book called Neurofeedback in the Treatment of Developmental Trauma. And it has a lot of relevance to dispute resolution and to family therapy. Anyway, to answer your question, Joanne, so attachment rupture, right? So the types of interactions that the family pathways study identified were negative intrusive behavior. So the mother mocks or teases the infant. Role confusion, draws attention, the mother draws attention to herself when the baby's in need, and a few others. The most important one was withdrawal. So the mother interacts from a distance, interacts silently, or backs away. So there's an innate, in the midbrain, there's an innate seeking response to attach. It's vital for the survival of the baby. So if the baby activates that and it's not reciprocated, the reaching out is not reciprocated, the baby sometimes keeps trying and then collapses. This is what they observed. And this dynamic, so this study is looking at factors in parent-infant attachment that predict borderline pathology and suicidality in late adolescent. The most significant pattern they saw, and that is established by 18 months, is the mother who withdraws and the baby who keeps trying. And Sabine explained there's this video of a baby that's crying. The mother comes into the room, sees the baby, sees the mother. The baby cries some more, reaches out for the mother, approaches the baby, and then turns and walks away. The baby crawls after the mother and then collapses on the floor. And Sabine said, this video, I haven't seen it, is very difficult to watch. And she's a world-renowned trauma therapist, and she said this, how she described it is, this is the whole story of most of the disorders in the DSM-5, which are better understood in terms of attachment rupture does is it changes there's a lot of Alan Shaw's work on attachment tells us that the baby needs a regulating other. When it's hungry, it needs to be fed, it needs to be kept comfortable. And at birth, there are no mechanisms for doing that. So the mother doing that establishes those neuronal pathways that then enable the baby to do that for themselves. And the capacity
self-regulate,
regulate, so that's really attachment 101 is a regulating other, right? If you don't have a regulating other, you can't learn to regulate yourself. And if you can't learn to regulate yourself, you actually don't have a self. The self is the capacity to self-regulate, if that makes sense, because you need to. Anyway, I probably shouldn't go into that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I diverted you there.
That's the critical thing.
Yeah.
And why one of the reasons I really offered to give the presentation, even though it's a bit challenging to fit it into an hour, is that I actually wrote this down. Oh yeah, anyway. I remember learning in my FDR course that there are essential criteria of suitability for FDR, right? The first, you have to be able to obey the ground rules, okay? So respect, be honest, transparent, etc. and respect of the other person, right? Now, what the current new findings in neuroscience are telling us is that traumatized people, the most significant symptom of trauma is a lack of self, right? So if people have developmental trauma, then they never have developed a self. They may be reactive all the time. But if they're just separated and they can't see their child or children, there's a very high risk these people are going to be experiencing symptoms of trauma. And their sense of themselves is going to be compromised. And so I think that needs to be taken into consideration, but I don't want to keep going down that path because it's just a rabbit hole.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. I'm spinning on that concept, but to me, just to confirm, it sounds like you're saying that the rupture of the separation or from childhood means that the person doesn't have that nice boundary between themselves and others, and the concept that we make our own choices about our behaviour embedded.
Yeah, so I'll just move along because I'd like to have a discussion. So to give people the opportunity to talk about how what I'm saying resonates, if it resonates with them, which I hope it does in some way. I haven't always, but I am now consistently looking for asking people more about their childhood as a routine assessment before therapy or any kind of dispute resolution, and just inquiring about, asking them questions about that. Like some people can't remember being nurtured by anybody, which is really interesting. And it's not labeling them because of that, but it's just starting to have a conversation about the capacity to reflect on themselves, etc. Yes, that the attendees today might get some ideas that would enhance their confidence assessing the suitability for FDR or mediation. What I've done in family therapy is felt quite comfortable or entitled or whatever, I don't know, because that's what I've always done in my work, is to explore people's histories in depth and talk about them. And I think it's one of the ways of healing trauma, particularly if people have a good history of relations, they may have developed a sense of self in that context. Then attune interaction, which means trauma sensitive, it means like respecting their agency and going at their pace, and motivational interviewing. Maybe some of you have heard of this. It's asking people to reflect on the consequences of what they do and what they want, etc., which I learned also in the FDR course with Joanne. I could, if you want, just give you couples of examples of how I engage with people in high conflict, if that interests you, or open it up to a discussion or questions. I'd just like to say, I think one of the things that I've learned to do and find really helpful is collaborate with people. Like this, I get people that ring me because they want to do a dispute resolution, and they've asked me to be a child advocate, for example, and I've interviewed the parents and the children, and that's been helpful. Or I might ask a dispute resolution practitioner to help with some things. If an FDRP doesn't feel comfortable, it's not the way things are done in their workplace, to go slower, have more. Because I guess most of the dispute resolution I do is in the realm of family therapy, but I use the FDR knowledge I've acquired to help with that.
Yeah, perhaps open up if people have got discussion questions, and then when John's put a question into chat as well. Dee, you got your hand up first.
Thank you. Thanks, Joanne. John, did you want to have your question answered first? John,
Sorry?
actually, yeah,
Sorry.
sorry, you popped a question into the chat. Do you want to have your question answered first, and then I'm
I
happy
don't
to
mind. Yeah,
delve into itself?
whichever way. Yeah. So I was just asking Jean-Pierre, what indicators tell you that a mediation would not be a viable option?
That's a great question. I think it's hard to tell because some of the initial interviews I had with people, I think certainly in some of the role plays that I was doing at MI, Mediation Institute, it would have been a 60I certificate on the spot, like a traffic fine. It's just not a no-go. But what I've found is, because I came to this not with the intention of even doing FDR, I remember this one case that turned out beautifully. This man had punched the mother of his and her children in the face in front of the 3 young children, very young. And when the mother brought the children to me for therapy, I asked her consent to talk to the father. And I put to him, are you willing to come in? Because your wife's come in, your ex-wife has come in, and are you willing to come in? And yeah, anyway, he said, yeah, I suppose you've heard her story. And I said, yes, I have, and I'd like to hear yours. And he said that in a kind of a disparaging way, obviously. Anyways, eventually he agreed to, with the mother's consent, always we were accountable to the mother. He apologised to the mother. He committed to atone for the harm he'd caused her and the children, and to meet with the children and apologise to them, and to teach them that what he'd done was appalling, and to support them to not, anyway, to help them. And that worked out really well. And normally people would think that's outrageous, or there's no way you could do FDR with that. But if I think back to my understanding of what trauma is, nobody ever, and people have known this, therapists have known this for decades, nobody ever intends or hopes to violent, but usually people that do this are highly reactive and they're terrified. They're in and with attuned practice, things are possible. I'm not saying they're always possible, but I'm saying that they are possible, and it's worth exploring, because the alternative I've seen many times is huge. A gap taken out of the children's lives where the parents don't get on. There's all sorts of things going on. I don't know if that answers your question, John.
Yeah, I understand it's a complex question. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I can touch base and maybe throw my 2 bobs worth in, if that's all right. Jean-Pierre, thank you so much for your time today. And Joanne, thank you for organising this. And I love the concept of discussion, because no 2 situations are the same, as we know, and everybody has a different dynamic and background, and also its choices. Like yourself, I'm a psychotherapist and a counsellor. So from a conflict perspective, and you mentioned earlier, Jean-Pierre, that's probably not the ideal space for you. I'm curious about conflict. I have very much an observer standpoint with regards to conflict, and I'm curious to understand what is actually feeding that. So the conflict is not the issue, it's the reason why they're in conflict. And a lot of it is fear-based. And a lot of it can be, if we unpack it, and of course we as FDRs are not counsellors and we're not therapists, and there's that fine line, isn't it? When you can obviously see that there's a dynamic happening, and with a few words and some open dialogue, perhaps there can be some way to get that individual in a space where they're open and receptive. And what I tend to do in my practice is my intake sessions are very rich. And it is about listening with the intent to understand. So I have found through utilising those skill sets is, if the intake, I can give each party a platform where they feel like they're being heard. It's almost like the steam of the pressure cooker is being released to prepare them for the joint mediation. And I had a case last week, which has been bouncing around apparently for about a year. and the two people hate each other. The gentleman left and the woman hasn't forgiven him for it. Giving them both a platform to actually let that out, we were able to successfully create a co-parenting plan for them by making sure we were focusing on the child's best interest. And fortunately for me, I'm new to FDR, as in December 2023, so I don't have any old habits that have laid over from the past. So I feel that's actually a privilege. So the child's best interest, I know no better than that's the way it should be, and especially with the new amendments that are coming through. So focusing on that and it's not the child's best interest in the lens of the parent. It's standing back as a parent and getting them to understand, let's observe your child, stand back on the outside, look at your child and work out, what do you think they need at their life stage? Put yourself in their shoes. Be the 5-year-old, be the 10-year-old. What is it that you needed? What is it that you experienced when you were a child at that age? For young boys, there's a certain age where, being with their father and seeing how he shaves his face and pretending that they've got whiskers on their face and embellishing that, and a mother that's nurturing and caring in a roundabout sort of way coming back again. Having that curious lens in relation to people in high conflict and then deciding, can you go to FDR? I think it's about empowering them to make a decision. Are they future focused? And that's that motivational interviewing concept, which is, do they want to have a better day tomorrow? So it's finding their motivation to find solution to dispute and to find resolution in dispute by tapping into their motivation. I think that's a key skill. I love how you mentioned motivational interviewing. There's not a lot of therapists that I've spoken to over the years that practice that, but I feel that's absolutely critical in empowering somebody to make best choices for themselves and hopefully for the greater good of the family unit.
Yeah, I agree with you that motivational interviewing works. And I think it works when people are not dissociated, which many traumatized people are. But even if they're dissociated, this is where collaboration and referral out comes in.
Yeah.
If they're dissociated, there are now effective treatments, even for what they call borderline personality disorder, which Sabine says she rather calls what happens to people who can't regulate themselves and identify with that inability to self-regulate. That's her definition of it, and it's mine. I'm borrowing hers, because why would we have a label like that discriminates against people who have that label? Because no one knows how to treat it. BPD. They don't know how to treat it. But with talk therapy, you can't treat it. And it doesn't respond to medication, nor suicidality. But with training the part of the brain which physiologically stores in dysrhythmic brain waves in the brainstem, that's what's triggered that physiological reaction that I described in the baby in the video. And BPD is more the baby who gives up. Oh, no, it's the baby who keeps trying. So they identify both with seeking and with the shock so you can't win. But if you calm their nervous system, they do reclaim a sense of self. And without a sense of self, the rhythms in the brain don't permit the person to reflect. So motivational interviewing doesn't work.
And again, not in the context of FDR. And it's interesting, Joanne, in that how can we proceed if worried about being unable to self-determine? I think that's critical, Joanne. A couple of weeks ago, I had a situation where one of the parties was not in a position to make a decision because of the pure intimidation. So we moved into shuttle and we unpacked that in shuttle and in off-site sessions, so that they felt that they weren't overshadowed by this cloud that stopped them from making a decision. So it's all about reading the room. I think coming back to what John was saying too, and FDRs aren't therapists, and I've got to remind myself of that in my FDR space, that I've got to find a pathway through the conflict that's going to be in the child's best interest, and I've only got that day to do it, and I've got nothing beforehand to prepare me for it apart from the intakes. And maybe that's worth a discussion too, which is, how do you get people to feel safe enough in such a brief period of time through mediation that they're prepared to do it? Yeah.
That's what I was going to ask you, Dee. Would it be a possibility to, or Joanne, is there some way of pausing or elongating or collaborating with a trauma therapist, because just 10 sessions of neurofeedback, for example, or maybe deep brain reorienting or something, can powerfully and quite quickly reactivate a person's sense of self, right? So that they are better able to take turns, to listen, to feedback what they've heard. If you are hypervigilant, stress-induced, trauma-induced hypervigilant, you can't listen. You're just waiting for that gap to just say, and you can't deal with that with words. You can't. The research tells us you just cannot. It's not a verbal thing. The left hemisphere isn't even online.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a range where, with our facilitation and keeping calm and maybe giving them a break and a bit of time, we can help them to get back online. But there's others that actually are really, as you say, getting them, hopefully trying to get them into some therapy so they're in a better place, and then sending. And there's no reason that we can't do that in FDR. Like, we don't have to see this as a one shot and you're gone, or mediation or any other intervention. In some ways, the funding and the models that it's been compressed, it's actually compressed the potential of the work, and we can resist that. But the other thing, just before we go to you, Wendy, John, you mentioned earlier on about the value of helping people to reflect on their childhood and their past. And you raised about putting in yourself in your child's position, and I had a light moment thinking about, well, that's a great way with these, with the new best interests of the child. Your child's 5. What was it like for you when you were 5? And they might be terrible. Nobody listened to me. We don't want that for your child, do we?
Yeah, very good, Joanne. I like that.
Yeah, so that's for me. That's because I've been spinning wheels a little bit about how we're going to get these conversations deeper and richer, and it's a great way. Thank you too. You've just
it's very much a Gestalt approach, which is put yourself in the chair opposite, and that's where and I use this probably on most of my clients and patients is I ask them to be curious. I ask them to be an observer, because when you use the word observe, you have immediately stepped out of that back into your lane, and you haven't stepped into somebody else's lane. You are standing on the outside looking in. So you have a different lens. So it automatically switches the way they look at that person. Rather than saying, how do you think they feel? Then they're involved. If you say, okay, I want you to be an observer of that person. So can you observe what is it that they're actually going through? Then it's a very different discussion. It's a very different viewpoint. So getting them to imagine what it's like being in a 5-year-old shoes or a 10-year-old shoes, God, the conversations are very interesting. And there's one of them last week was like, oh, don't tell me, 15 years of age, I do not want my child to do the things that I did when I was 15. And I said, okay, you got out of it all right. Look at you now. You're pretty cool.
Absolutely. Wendy's got lots of observation history in the background as an educator.
Thanks so much for this, Jean-Pierre.
Hi, Wendy. Thank you.
Yeah, it's quite rewarding hearing somebody talk about attunement.
Thank you.
Going back to the work of the great Dan Stern and, of course, Shaw as well, and who were great inspirations for me in my field of psychology with parent-infant interactions and my research. And the problem that I think most society has is that they've never heard about attunement, and that they don't know about reciprocal interactions within what parents' effect has on the child. And this goes way right back to birth. If a mother is depressed, as you were mentioning about attachment and how the baby becomes depressed, and that can last right throughout their childhood. And of course, then that carries into their adult space as well. Getting that perspective of understanding people who come into mediation as a high conflict, let's just call them high conflict personality for the fact of what we're doing here. I think we need to take stock of how we how we talk about the onion layers. I think we need to think through how to allow this person to have the conversation. And you talked about trust, Jean-Pierre, and that is about how we need to start the conversation is by building the trust within that person. As you say, some of them have come in with being physically violent, and the children have had that visual of the parent being of their parent being violent, but we don't know that trigger of what caused that violence within that person. It may have just been that one-time reaction and lights out. And I think it's, as you say, to give everybody a chance, to give everybody that voice, and to start taking off the layers of their story. And it's for us to listen to. And we all know about safety aspects and within mediation, but are they willing to tell you that story? And I think from there we have to be listeners, but we also have to understand about how their reactions are. And then it can come down to the fact that they actually cry, that they are remorseful for what they've done. But it's us as mediators giving them that time, that space, that understanding, and no judgment to start with. And okay, yes, some people are high conflict, and that may well never change. And it's not up to us as mediators to go into that with them, because that's where a therapist needs to come into. But there are some people who will always be the high conflict personality as well. I just think, as we all said today, I think that we need to give them a chance and understand where they've come from, perhaps within their lives as well. Yeah, when I saw the word attunement there about what you were presenting, I thought, oh, this is great, because it's exactly what I worked with as far as parent-infant interactions go. Thank you. And I'm not an FDRP. I'm not an FDRP purely because Joanne knows this story. I was going to become an FDRP, but I just thought it's way too much sometimes to start unpacking people's stories and the children involved as well. And I thought there are plenty of people out there who are doing it. I'll just go to the base. I'll just go and become an NMAS. Even those stories in themselves are very vital stories. So thanks, Jean-Pierre. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with some of what you said, and it's only recently I actually really grasp this, is that if someone is traumatized, they need help. And what I feel I can do as a therapist or FDR practitioner is to include them in decision making. Right. I'll say, like, how capable are you of really listening to someone when you disagree with what they're saying? And how are you feeling? A lot of the time they don't even know they're feeling. And it's like negotiating with them, what can we do about this? Because it's what options can we come up with that you think reasonable to make you better able to participate in a discussion about how you want to get involved with the children, for example, and just give it time. And if the person is traumatized, I don't think we'd be able to do that in FDR if it's limited to a process like premediation, the initial session with each person and then together and so on. But that's where I think, yeah. And I sometimes have recommended, if there's an ICL, an independent children's lawyer or something, I'd say, look, I can't help these parties come to an agreement now, but one of the parties has agreed, or they both agreed to this holding pattern, and that will do some work. I've got one man that was like this, and I did some neurofeedback with him, and his insight just blossomed, and he was able to take responsibility authentically and satisfy the court by satisfying the mother, who's the only person who really knew how annoying or threatening or whatever he was. And he was able to convince her that he had insight. And yes, but that takes time, and that I think we can negotiate for some time because it's a cheaper, more child-focused option than saying we'll issue an exemption. I think I've had quite a few because of the way I work. I don't know. It's just happened like that.
And I think the problem is we've got a paradox really, because we need to protect the person who's of the behaviour, and yet we often do that by discriminating against someone who's got a mental health issue and a dysfunction. We treat them as bad rather than someone who's not able to function within a range that we can work with. Out comes the judgment.
And you know what the other word is too? Tolerance. Is as neutral participants and facilitating these conversations to resolve conflict, we should be tolerant that we may have to communicate and facilitate questions differently to either parties in order to be able to pull that thread so that they can find their voice. We have to meet them where they're at, as opposed to making the assumption that we can communicate in the same way to two people. Again, listen with the intent to understand, watch the cues, the signals, be curious, have tolerance, making sure that individual feels safe, heard, in order to find their self. And look, we're not going to unpack that in mediation. It's not going to happen. No. But I think if we can employ some of those therapeutic skills, as you've mentioned, Jean-Pierre, which is a component of our FDR course, and I have to say, on a professional level, that certainly supports me in how I manage high conflict. And if we can play that in without making it a therapeutic session, but making it feel therapeutic as a result that they've got a resolution, hey, that's a win.
Yeah, no, very interesting. And the same way we would if someone's on the spectrum and their way of thinking, and they've often got an overlay of trauma because the society's not set up for their way of thinking. Yeah, there's, I suppose, as mediators, our skills and expertise in communicating and seeing people's needs is definitely where we need to be strong and working. A question for Jean-Pierre or anyone else, how do we find that line of this is, and there isn't a line, it's a grey zone of I can't work with this person now or anymore? Is it a conversation with them? Is it, I suppose I'm looping back to John's question, really.
I feel like it touches on both what you're saying, Joanne, and what Dee was just saying, is that it's really rare that, I think, rare-ish, that a person who's traumatized or has these issues can't regulate themselves, let's say, or struggles to regulate themselves, is going to be in a relationship with someone who's really well regulated. And one of the dilemmas I have found in my practice as a family therapist and a single expert and an FDR is the hazard of the first interview. So I fully attuned with the first party I meet, and I think, wow, this is so easy. Like, I don't even need to interview the other person, and I'm going to interview them. And I get a whole different experience. But there's a risk that the person that I personally resonate with best will influence what I do and how I perceive this. And there's some really complex dynamics in some families where children are at risk, and the person who presents as protective is highly disturbed, and that disturbance places a real risk to the child. And it's easier to say she's safer than him or vice versa, whatever it is. But I think, I'm not too sure that's actually right. But it's expedient and maybe that's all we can have. But it's nice to just think about it, really, perhaps, and to just keep an eye on it, maybe, and review it or something.
And look, sometimes the court's got better resources than those of us that are providing services outside the court, and that may be needed to get those eyes on the child and see what's happening. But it's a problem when there's not really a good enough parent.
And there used to be this term used called parent alienation syndrome, and then it was tabooed. And I think it still is taboo. And I had a family very recently where the first time I met the mother, she was furious at me, at the building I was in, at life. And it's just one of those cases where I just couldn't get through. What I did is I actually was inadequately sensitive, inadequately patient. I wasn't as attuned as I should have been. And that's a lesson for me. But it's hard when someone's telling you to get effed and calling you a liar and everything but I've got another matter where I'm working with where this man, I think, has been traumatized by the extension of these proceedings. I've seen him for about 3.5, 4 years, and he is just declining. And there's no merit in the allegations against him that I can see. And I think this is something I've seen quite a few times, is that people make a cognitive, that it's like a cognitive assessment. It's like this, it's like there's a gendered lens for family violence, for example. And if, like, some of the allegations this man that I'm seeing makes were made by a woman, and I'm not being sexist. I think, Joanne, you know me well enough to know I'm not being, but what I'm saying is that I'm concerned by how gendered the lens can be sometimes in assessments by single experts, for example. It's scary because the consequences are mammoth for the children and for the person that's falsely accused of things.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, look, absolutely. We continue to hope, and I think there's going to be improvements as there becomes a complaint management or a complaint process for the child experts and those sorts of things. And at the moment, it's very much, there's not really a avenue of review if they get it wrong. I'm optimistic that it will improve, but then again, but I do, I've certainly seen situations where the wrong person's identified as the one that's causing the harm in the family, or the predominant harm in the family. Often there's a whole lot of dynamics going on, but we've come to the end of our time together, which is very sad. It's been delightful, and thank you, Jean-Pierre. It's really helped to trigger a few connections for me, and hopefully for others that have been participating. And most
Thanks,
of all,
Joan.
remembering to be present and connect with the people, so that we've got a chance to help unpack some of what's been going on.
Yeah.
Is that any final thoughts from you, Jean-Pierre?
I'm just grateful for the course at MI, and in terms of one of the things I loved about my course, and I'm still like keeping in touch, is these debates and these discussions, because they're so important to have, to not try and be expert or to agree how things should be, but to really challenge each other's thoughts. And I find that of immense value, and it's very rare. And it's one of the things I like about Mediation Institute, is that it fosters this sort of discussion.
I agree with you there, Jean-Pierre, and I think that's so worthy of saying it, because we do work in a very isolated space because it's private and it's confidential. So where can we freely throw around the process, the experiences, the different interpretations. Where can we do that in a safe zone? And Joanne, you affect this really well. So that's really lovely of you to acknowledge Mediation Institute. I agree. Before I did my course, like yourself, I interviewed a number of companies, and it was the warm embrace and the transparency of Joanne and Paul, your true passion and commitment to resolving conflict. You're not a conflict specialist. You are passionate about the resolution of conflict.
Yeah.
And I think too also that sometimes it's harder it's easier if you're working on your own to engage in like, I know that's one of the things I love about being in private practice is that I can say what I think I want to say, and which is really good. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But look, I think for all of us, if we get ourselves in the mindset that we're the expert and we know everything, it stops us growing, it stops us learning, and seeing when we don't do it right, when we could have done something better, and maybe we can't turn back time yet. I'm wanting that invention, but for the next client that's got something similar, we're going to be in tune. We're going to have a better outcome, hopefully.
Yeah, I'll just share one little short story before we go. I had a case of expostosis last night, panicking about today. So like, I don't normally drink.
Don't tell me you've got imposter syndrome.
Yeah. No, I don't normally. So I thought I'm just going to go and do what I always do at these MI discussions and just have a yarn about this.
Yeah.
And I've really enjoyed it. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you got something out of it, because I did.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon, great weekend as well. Take care.
Yes, bye-bye.